Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Norris. We're going to grow your leadership through neuroscience, psychology, and theology. Welcome, everybody, to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. I'm here with Dr. Todd Bowman. Excited to be catching up,
Yes.
man. We got a lot to talk about today.
Indeed.
Yeah. So to just begin with, how you doing?
Oh, man, I have a full heart. It's been just a great run of weeks. We've been blessed to have been on the road with our boys, soccer, family experiences, obviously the holiday, being able to be with family, and kind of the light at the end of the tunnel a little bit with this kind of pandemic situation. And there's this new variant swirling. I'm watching a lot of fear. I think back to a couple years ago when you and I started here, or when I was on talking about, like, what is this Corona situation, what is going on? And it's just been fascinating as a psychologist to watch not just the evolution of the virus, but the evolution of people's response and how some people are still really stuck in fear and how others have kind of been able to transcend some of that paralysis and some of that fear. So I come with a full heart, having had really positive experiences familially, and I'm kind of watching this disruption of flow. That's what I want to call it today. This disruption of flow that is happening for people emotionally, it's happening for family systems, it's happening for church and school systems, but it's also happening culturally. And I think it's important for us to tune into what are those disruptions of flow that we're experiencing, and what can we do to regain that, to kind of turn off the negativity, to turn off the fear, and really find that flow once again.
Which, when you talk about the different people that approach the coronavirus and COVID-19, from some with extreme fear in the spectrum, and then others that are very dismissive, almost in a denial altogether. Your heart isn't to take either extreme and judge them. Your heart is curious. I saw a graphic the other day that I actually kept, which showed the difference in judgment and curiosity. And it was a graphic that just started with kind of a flowchart approach. And it started at the top, I have an idea, then it pins off to 2, then it springs off to 4, and then it springs off to 8. And it's the idea of really wanting to dig into, as a leader, first, my story. Where is the anxiety showing up in me? And how do I approach it and then manage it, cope with it, etc.? And then also the people that I lead, my family, my wife, my kids, how are they managing it? Never projecting judgment on them, but just that deep curiosity. And then the judgment part of the graphic was just one line, small. It's just a decision, done. So talk a little bit. Let's and what we want to do today is, you and I just want to catch up and allow the audience to kind of eavesdrop in on that conversation. But, there's so much going on with clients. And there's upticks. There's, I was reading from the CDC, anxiety is increased by 42% in terms of reporting. In your work, and you and I in our conversations, and in our clients, we realize that that's very minimal compared to reality. 42% probably
reported, right? 42% reporting, which is part of it.
And nobody's ever asked me to report, so I'm one of those guys. I've never reported on anything. So how do you get into a statistic? That's what I'm curious about. So at any rate, when you are thinking about what you're seeing in your practice, and you can interweave, the new variant, you can interweave anything that you want. But as you're seeing people in your practice, what are some of the more upticks in issues? What are people dealing with right now?
And so that's where I want to start with this idea of disruption of flow. Right? So flow would be our ability to mentally navigate our life space, our world, in ways that are congruent with our values, our beliefs, our personalities, in a way that accomplish the tasks that we're called to do. Work, relationships, parenting, leadership, etc. So when that flow is flowing, right, like, we're able to successfully minimize distractions. We're able to prioritize. We're able to delegate. We're able to be present. All these things that we would look to and designate as, like, those are really successful leadership attributes, parenting attributes, marital attributes, etc. Right? Like, a lot of that is driven by Can we find a flow? Can we get in a flow? And can we generate momentum? And out of that, we tend to birth success.
Yeah.
Right? Because we've been in times when, as parents, we're in the flow and we know when we're not. And oftentimes when our kids are kind of acting up or acting out in some ways, like they're just holding up a mirror. Like, it's not about them.
Yeah.
And I would suggest, like, pastors they're listening in, just like parents, if there's something going on in the church, like, you don't need to judge it, don't need to pathologize it and say, like, oh, these people are... It just means, like, there's something of flow that's been disrupted in the system, and, like, it's a minute to take a step back and look at your own life, like, where's my flow? And that's where you started, right? Like, with all this other life stuff, systemic stuff, like, as a pastor, as a leader, as a parent, like, it starts with us.
Yeah.
And how do we shift to find our flow again? What am I seeing in my practice? I'm seeing lots of consequences and lots of manifestations of people who have lost their flow. Right? There's been this disruption of sorts. Some of that is sociological. I mean, we saw this. This happens frequently, but we saw it really intensely last year with election season, and we saw that again. I guess it was 2 years ago. We saw that again this year, right, with more local elections. Some of the intensity of that and the emotionality of that, and how big of a space all of a sudden local elections took up in our lives. I've never voted in a local election, Patrick, until this year. Right, like, because there was that much emotional energy underneath it, driving it, compelling it, conversations happening around it, and that's good. It's good to be involved at the local level. I think that's part of maybe what will be born out of the pandemic experience is the importance of really truly being engaged as neighbors, as friends, as communities, and like those things have a huge capability for disrupting our flow, redirecting our focus and our eyes away from what it means to be locked in as a parent, as a spouse, as a leader, as a church person on my end, not a pastor. But that's just one, right? Like the elections are one. We've got this still ongoing pandemic and now new variants. It's just another place where our eyes get distracted. And some of us, because of our personal histories, our eyes get distracted and go toward those things away from flow a bit more quickly. So again, back to like, there's no judgment. If anything, I try and approach this whole conversation very objectively and very compassionately. And I don't think that the fringe extremes they might be the loudest voices, but they're not the largest percentages of the population. Right.
And you look at it as a scientist, as an analyst, your curiosity, as is mine, is pretty large.
Really driven by how can we help, right? Like, we have to understand this to be able to help,
Absolutely.
To be able to lead.
So when you are talking about how it manifests, how the disruption of flow manifests, what would be some of the more common issues that an individual, things from addictions to marriage, what's showing up in marriage, what's showing up in parenting, what's just showing up in a person's overall well-being?
Maybe to help me kind of have a schema to work with, let's go cognitive, affective, and physical.
And when you say affective, you're talking emotional
experience, worry and things.
Cognitive is the rational. Okay.
Right. So to start with cognitive, right? Like, what's really interesting is when we lose flow, we're more kind of drawn away by, we're enticed by just our own kind of dysfunctional thoughts, we could call that, from a cognitive behavioral perspective. Like, what are automatic thoughts would be another way of thinking about this. Like, what are the distortions, the beliefs I have about myself that aren't true? Maybe we call them lies about. And John Gottman's work, the Gottman Institute's work, recently has focused on perspective we hold of the spouse. The best predictor of relational success is how we view our spouse, positively or negatively. It's that simple.
So wait, say that one more time.
The Gottman Institute, right? Like this, like, leading marital success research institute, breaks down the probability of successful relationship is all about, like, in times of rupture or distress, can we hold a positive view or hold our spouse in a positive light? Irrespective of the hurt they've caused, or does it flip? Right. So when we're out of flow and we go back into those really historical beliefs, I mean, think about, right? Like, am I lovable? Am I worthy? Am I a fraud? Am I an imposter? Like, parentally, those, like, we have to navigate those beliefs should they be awakened, because we don't know what we're doing when we're parents. Right? When you're a brand new parent, you have some words of wisdom people give you. A baby comes out, and it's like, good luck, Godspeed.
Right.
What? I've been in pastoral ministry for 4 years, running a campus ministry at Oklahoma State. It was the exact same. Like, I wasn't a dad at that point, but it was the exact same experience. Like, here's a house, here's 15 apartments, you're supposed to build something with it. Good luck, Godspeed.
Yeah, right.
What? Talk about insecurity, talk about fraudulence. Am I worthy of, like, why me? Why did God call me to this? So I think there's a parallel here between, like, what we experience paternally, and we've talked about this quite a bit in directly on this podcast. But there's a parallel between what we see paternally and what we see pastorally.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, irrespective of which vein we're talking about, those beliefs from the past, really rooted in our wounds. Bob Schutz's work and his book Be Healed talks about wounds, lies, and vows. And in this cognitive part, under the umbrella that I'm talking about here, this cognitive piece is just, what are those thoughts, beliefs about ourselves, lies, right? Things people have said about us, the unfair criticisms or undue criticisms that we've received that found a chink in our armor, and we just still carry those. When we lose our flow, right, like, those whispers grow louder.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that's part of what I'm seeing.
Because it's survival. It threatens your survival and belonging. But yes. Oh, that's awesome.
So what am I seeing cognitively? Like, that's what I'm seeing. Is we could talk about addictions, but how addictions are really rooted in these unresolved wounds, and then these beliefs about self. I'm bad. I'm unlovable. I'm unworthy. Nobody's going to love me like this.
Yeah.
Nobody cares enough about me to take care of my needs. I've got to take care of my own needs.
Yeah.
So Carnes and others talk about kind of this progression in the beliefs of addiction.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm saying. Like, so obviously we talk about anxiety. There's been an uptick in anxiety. There's been an uptick in addiction too, from alcohol to other substances to shopping. And even sexual addiction. Right? Like, we're seeing an uptick because of the distress, right? Like, it activates our survival systems neurologically, and we're moving toward, like, what can help me cope in the moment. But if we're locked into momentary survivalistic operating, like, best indicator we're not in flow is that we're looking at, right, like, where's my next escape, my next coping moment, my next relief coming from? Right, like, flow is very much like, I can navigate the present, but I have this longer term perspective in mind versus everything is defined by the immediacy of them. And I think what's interesting to tie in this Omicron or whatever I don't know who gets to decide these variants.
Right.
The next variable of doom that we're all having to navigate, that has propensity to pull us into almost this tyranny of the unhappy present moment. And like, it's happening again. We don't even know yet.
Right.
We don't have good information.
Right.
And yet, so what do we do? We don't have good information. What do?
Catastrophize.
We sit in those beliefs, those wounds all get activated. How many people have said, like, oh no, here we go again?
Yeah.
Welcome to the Red Ink Revival Leadership Podcast. My name is Patrick Norris, and I am a husband, father, pastor of 35 years, and a strategic therapeutic mentor to leaders in all arenas of life. I am an inerrantist, a Calvinist Arminian betweenist, a Holy Spirit continuist, and a finished work of Christ redemptionist. Red Ink Revival was designed to create a revival in the heart, soul, and brains of Christian leaders from all spheres of influence. Our team of pastors, psychologists, and therapists facilitate our life-changing leadership, personal growth, and emotional wholeness experiences. Our goal is to bring a revival, an integrated wholeness to pastors, church staff, the local church, and the universal Big C church around the world. This includes marketplace leaders, educators, foster adoptive parents, and so much more. If this podcast is providing value to you, would you consider subscribing to it wherever you get your podcast? Also, please like the episodes, comment on them, and share them on your social media feeds. And one more big favor. If you like the show, please go review it at Apple. And if it's true of you, give us 5 stars. Now let's go back to this week's episode.
And what's fascinating is that the original doctor who reported this gave symptoms around it that was very mild symptomatically, way milder than Delta and some of the others.
Which is what every biological immunologist or virologist has said. Like, it's going to increase in its transmissibility and it's going to decrease in its virulence.
And when it first came out in the press, immediately happening.
Right.
We're about to shut down everything again. It's like, wait, what?
And it could be, right? Like you and I, like all we have is the information we've been given, but none of that information is about. But it's interesting how quickly we're dismissive of.
Yes.
Like, let's take a deep breath.
Yeah.
Like, we don't know enough yet to catastrophize.
Right.
But I think it speaks to how much unresolved trauma really exists. And that's still not even being labeled appropriately. I was in a conversation with a school board member and a number of other community leaders, and the thought of calling what we're seeing in the schools with our kids acting out, bullying, my wife's a substitute teacher, literally like in her classroom as a substitute, desks being flipped on top of kids, like stuff that does not populate our local Johnson County school districts all that often. Nor would I say most school districts around the country. There's all these indicators of trauma. I've provided literature to these leaders and decision makers around, like, here's how you know you're seeing trauma in students, and like every tick or every box is checked. We don't want to call it that. We don't want to name what it is.
Yeah.
But when we don't name it, and this is as much a personal reality, right? Like, how much of that 42% increase is actually bigger, but because people don't want to, like, I'm going to deny the fact that I'm anxious.
Yeah.
I know I'm anxious, right? Like, I've got all these running thoughts. I've got all these fears that are, I'm catastrophizing. But if I call it anxiety, that makes it more scary.
Right, because we are threatened by the idea of anxiety. So it's interesting because when we are thinking through this, we've got trauma. You keep mentioning the trauma piece, that it awakens trauma. That when we have this whole pandemic and the political season and the racial unrest, all those three are the big three right now in this last few years, that for everybody, highly sensitized content. And the threat level on each one of those, it doesn't matter who you are, what background you have, the threat level in our culture is increased. And so when you're talking about like a student in school, first, they're being traumatized by masks. They're being traumatized by the inability to connect and to have the freedoms that they once have. But then they also have traumas that have been built over a lifetime, and those awaken and then bond with the present trauma, and then everything becomes exaggerated.
Yeah. Disruption of flow. Like, how much of traumatic experiencing is an intrusive disruption of flow in a way that threatens bodily integrity or bodily harm is involved. Like, trauma is a type of disruption of flow. Yeah. What's fascinating to me, and I've volunteered in my older two boys are in the middle school. I've been in the building. Fascinating to experience the difference between the 8th graders, the 7th graders, and the 6th graders.
Wow.
And let me break this down for you. There's an explanation for it in my mind. The 8th graders at least had part of their 6th grade year in that building.
Yeah.
Like, they were oriented to the teachers. They were socialized into the space. Wow. They learned the expectations. And then it got disrupted. Yeah. And then they got to go back. And when they went back, it was with gratitude and with a script for, like, how do we engage in the middle school building when they went back in March of their 7th grade year. So they're out from their 6th grade year to March of their 7th grade year, did everything online, at least in our Spring Hill School District. And then got to go back. But they went back having already been socialized into what the expectations were. Right? The 7th graders, who would have been in 6th grade, right? Yeah. Last year. Well, they were 5th graders when their academic experience was cut short. So here we have a group of kids who didn't have any closure to their elementary school experience. They didn't have any sense of celebration. They didn't end well. They didn't have any socialization of 6th grade except for a few weeks where everything was so new, and then the summer hit. Yeah. So now they're showing up this fall as 7th graders. The last full year of school they had was 4th grade. Wow. Think about the developmental differences between 4th graders and 7th graders.
Oh my God.
Like, how much growth has been interrupted.
It's radical.
Emotionally, behaviorally, academically, as far as a learning, psychology of learning perspective. Right. And then we have the 6th graders. So we have the 8th graders who had the better part of a year in the building, got socialized and know the people, know the place. Yeah. Right. Like, that buoyed them. When they came back to something they knew. Yeah. The now 7th graders came into something that they didn't really know. After having been online, they don't know the people. They've had no structure, no oversight, home most of the day, some of them by themselves, with no idea what they're seeing or exploring or doing online in that space, by the way. Then they come and they go from back to boundaries, like almost zero boundaries, to all these stringent boundaries. Then there's an overcorrection, like these kids have no boundaries. Now we have to lock them down.
Yeah.
Right. And then we have the sixth graders, who, at least in our school district, right, had no interruption to their flow of learning. They were in the building, they were masked. There was disruption of flow there, but not nearly in the same way that we see with the current 7th and 8th grade. So their experience is uninterrupted, right? Like they got celebrated well. They got to have closure to their elementary school experiences. They launched well. They started well.
Wow.
Right? Now, I can tell you there's a high, medium, and low affective disturbance by group. And our listeners have probably already put it together, right? Like the low disruption group is the 6th graders who never missed a beat, right? Like their academic experience, by and large, continued.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of disruption, right? But like from March to the end of the school year in 2020, but like it's continued for them. The 8th graders, that medium group, right? Like they had a disruption, but they already knew their teachers. They were a part of the system. They were socialized and integrated into the system. And then they had something good to get back to, something known to get back to.
Wow.
But I can tell you, having stood in the hallway and watching these 7th graders walk down, you can feel the trauma just rolling off of them.
Wow.
They're like zombies. And again, not disparaging these kids. They're byproducts of the trauma that's happened and a system that's trying to control them.
Yeah.
Right? Rather than helping them process and resolve their experience, giving them language for their experience. But if we can't, as educators, as parents, agree to use the most appropriate language, I'm not talking like PTSD.
Right.
I'm not saying every 7th grader has PTSD at our school. I'm not saying that. But we have to acknowledge, like, if it's true that disruption of flow is potentially traumatizing, and we have kids who are exhibiting lots of signs of trauma, we've got to pay attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
Got to pay attention. So it's an interesting microcosm, I think, for let's pan out for a little bit, right? Churches probably fall in that same like low, medium, high model that I've just kind of arbitrarily created. Right? Like some churches in some places geographically, like there's no disruption of flow. There's no interruption of practicing of their faith, of deepening the faith, of continuing to meet together, having services. Some places it changed for a little bit, and like then there was a known thing to get back to. Others are probably not high. The high group where like things just shut down and you got no choice. Think of a pastor in Canada, right? Like you're going to get arrested if you violate these edicts and declarations that have come down.
Yeah.
Like, and people have to choose, but like there's trauma in that.
Yeah.
Like, am I willing to like be thrown in jail for 90 days and lose my livelihood or my company or my job or
have my congregation if they don't like what I'm doing? Yeah.
So pastors, right? Like, no judgment in this, but like pastors have to tune in to what's the reality of my circumstance. Like, what are, and I think this is hard too for district leaders, for building administrators at the academic level, school level, right? Like, what choice did I make? And how are the people under my care, be they students in a school or parishioners in a church context, how are they carrying the resultant effects of the decisions that were made in the context that we experienced? Because it's different.
Yeah.
It's different. Missouri side, Kansas side, Overland Park, Spring Hill.
Different states.
Yes. Different.
Even countries.
Hey, have you ever wanted to explore how your backstory is influencing your present story? Have you ever wondered why you were driven the way you were driven, or why you want the things you so deeply want, or why you might be triggered the way you're triggered? Maybe there's something in your life that keeps derailing you or exposing the fractures in your heart and soul. At Red Ink Revival, I facilitate groups of 6 to 10 men or 6 to 10 ladies in an exploration process that includes worksheets, tools for discovery, and insights into personal motivations, torments, and reactions. And it's all done online through Zoom in a short 6-week experience. Now don't worry, you won't be required to share anything you don't want to. Your story is yours to share when and where you're ready. But first, you owe it to yourself to know what that story actually is. Our alumni report having life-changing experiences and integrations in all spheres of life. They report it actually felt like they entered into a revival. They even say they now lead others like never before as they instinctively map their teammates' own story considerations. We're developing groups specific for individual classifications like senior pastors or spouses, church staff, educators, foster adoption parents, marketplace leaders, and churches at large. Go to redinkrrevival.com and find the events tab to learn more.
And when you think of this, just one, small in the overall world we live in, small part of kids going to school, how does that impact mom? And how does that impact dad?
Absolutely. How
does that impact the marriage, the flow of the family system? And then you've got career disruptions and uncertainty in a lot of those areas. So you gave three. You said cognitive, affective, rational, emotional, and then what was the last one?
Physiological.
Talk about that for a little bit.
So we've talked some about like these core beliefs and automatic thoughts that we tend to have about ourselves that get awakened into stress, and when we're out of our flow, those tend to get louder. Affectively, we're talking a lot about trauma and anxiety. Probably we'd have to be honest to say there's some depressive stuff going on as well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
so people kind of go one of two ways. A lot of it is rooted in their autonomic nervous system. Like, are they going to activate into stress, or are they going to kind of flood and kind of hit the floor?
Yeah.
Right. So anxiety-related disorders and depressive disorders, and we can do both, right? Like we kind of trade out. They're very similar neurophysiologically or neurochemically, rather. So I've seen those three, right? There's a trauma dynamic, an anxiety dynamic, and a depressive dynamic. Physiologically, though, I think that's probably where these signs and symptoms show up the most.
Yeah.
Right. So if I could, behaviorally, right? Like just because we're talking about schools, behaviorally, like there's been so much evidence of disruption of flow. Kids aren't listening. We get emails every week. Like 50% of the class, like not like that 6-hour class, like the entire grade hasn't turned in this assignment.
Yeah.
Okay, like I don't assume that every child is a bad kid. In fact, I really tend to assume that most kids are reflections of the experiences and systems that they've been a part of.
Yeah.
So when we have an indicator like that, hey, all the 6th grade teachers are sending out parents of every 6th grade child, 50% of indicator light for me, right? Like, let's get curious about that. What is going on? Like, what is the resistance? What is the protest? Right? It might not be protest. It might just be like, we didn't get that last year. Like, we didn't have a chance to cover that. It's unknown to us. Rather than going to this, back to the word judgmental, right? Like this assumption that like these 6th graders are just terrors. These 7th graders are just unmanageable. That's not true.
Right.
It's not true. Like, they might feel unmanageable, but their behaviors are the indicator lie, right? Like, what we're saying is, like, these behaviors are inappropriate for the academic environment. Totally agree. Probably shows up at churches, too.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how people are dealing with one another, talking to their pastor.
Oh, yeah. I saw an immediate uptick when we first started meeting again after we had been in lockdown. An immediate reactivity of directness, that people were, not everybody, but there were people who had never been direct with me who became very direct, and you could tell it was protective mechanisms. It was, I'm doing this to push you so that I can deal with my anxiety, and that's how they would process it. And so you put that into marriages, you put it into every single system that we're a part of.
At church, in the home, in the school, yes.
Everything. It's interesting because when we think of, clients, I look at myself and I am a very free, moving, exploratory, creative. I love seeing things. I'm a person that if I drive to a building like our church campus, if I drive there one way, I try to come home the other way. Mm-hmm. I just like seeing something new. Mm-hmm. So the whole world was really an exploration opportunity. And even during COVID, when COVID hit, Tina and I got married in 90. So our 30th year anniversary was in 2020. Well, we had massive plans,
Right.
big plans. We were wanting to go to perhaps France or Italy and spend, I was, thinking, man, if we could go for a couple of weeks, get an Airbnb out in the country, live like the locals, go for walks and, all that. It was such a cool idea. And then we morphed it. Maybe we would want to go to Washington, D.C. We love museums. And when COVID hit, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go out of the country. I don't want to go to another nation. I don't want to go through the travel harassment. I don't want to have to, and it's not fear for me, it's dealing with everything else that everyone carries in interaction. I just don't want to have to deal with that. So, I'm scheduling right now as a guest speaker through 2022. And the, pastors that I talk to, if they're within a 10-hour drive, I'm driving. I just don't want to deal with it. But what happens for me is, and this is what I notice, is I have a fusion of grief because I've lost. Here's what I lost, and this is so powerful. I lost my freedom to explore like I once had without any filters. Before there were no real filters. Now you got these massive filters. So I've lost the beauty and the wonder of just doing whatever I want when I want. Then I've lost the nation that I grew up in. I lost, and it doesn't matter where you fit on the liberal conservative spectrum.
It's just different.
Everybody's lost.
Different. Yep.
It's not the same country. And now it's a country that if you have an opinion, conservative or liberal, you're going to potentially be exploited. And we live in a world where everybody's exploited. I mean, you say one thing dumb, or you don't even have to say it dumb. There will be a meme. If you have any fame at all, I'm not worried about me, but there's any fame at all, you're going to be exploited. Well, that's culturally being shoved down our throats to the common person. And they're like, whatever you do, don't have an opinion. We are being vanillaized. That's a new word. We're being put into the place of do not commit to anything. So what I've lost is I've lost the feeling of I'm safe in any environment. You connect the grief, and if you don't process that grief, which most people have never, ever even thought that that's possible, to process that grief. And then if you combine that, in my case, with anxiety, where I began to notice anxiety, and anxiety manifests for me. Yeah, I mean, I began to see different trends, and I'm like, whoa, I'm not doing this to do it. There's anxiety somewhere that I feel, is covert. It's right now not showing itself as anxiety, but it is. I mean, it's expressing. And then the last part is anger. And what's interesting is you put those three together, and you have intense energy that makes you live in violation of your own values. And if you don't address it, it will take you places that are dark, that are deep, and that actually will cause you a lot of years of recovery. And so, I look at it in my life and the journey I've been on, I've learned some tools. So whenever I start noticing all that, I turn towards them, I process them. I'm interested in them. I allow them to serve me by asking it questions. What are you anxious about? What's going on? And I allow it to gauge communication. But so many people and so many pastors maybe have never been trained in it, which is why we have Red Ink Revival. Is I'm passionate to help pastors not suffer in the ways that I suffered and that I really am not suffering today over. So we then, as mental health professionals, we are helping our clients, and at the root of everything is grief, anxiety, and anger. And the anger, part of it is good, and then it jumps over the midline and becomes unhealthy. So is that, as you are working with clients, would you resonate with that same, kind of framework? And are you helping your clients work through the grief, the anxiety, and their anger?
Yeah, I mean, that resonates for sure with the breadth of my caseload. In many ways, those are drivers of relational discord. They're drivers of addictive behavior or any type of unhealthy self-soothing, even if it's not addictive. But the problem is, like in that, we are looking to mediate a temporary experience with a temporary solution instead of activating self-awareness, utilizing our self-reflection, really going back in our story.
Yeah.
And I think that's what's been so hard. A lot of mindfulness practices are about getting really present. I think spiritual disciplines are about being really present.
Yes.
I think what's interesting is to have watched over time the waning of that belief that I can escape all the intensity in healthy ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
Spiritually appropriate ways. There's been this kind of, as our kind of degrees of freedom, you talked about ability to explore, ability to retain my belief that the world is ultimately safe and I can navigate my way through it. Like as that space has shrunk and as those degrees of freedom, as I would call them, have been minimized, what happens when we mindfully go into the present, but the present is full of like all these extremely anxiety awakening, I mean, just look, I was on Yahoo the other day, everything, new variant this, new variant that, and even like disparate pieces of information.
Right.
I'm like, buckle up, folks, it's going to be bad.
Yeah.
How do we know?
Yeah.
Right? Like we don't, but like there's just this ever-present doom and gloom. So when we try and tune in with mindful awareness, but what we're tuning into is an intensity of distress.
Yeah.
Like we pull back right away and we're stuck in anger, anxiety, and grief. And if anything, like as we try and go get information in the information age, our attempts at going to get information to downregulate any of those, like, just get higher. There's another case here. There's a jury verdict about this. There's a doctor who says this, right? Like we've been socialized into going to find information to downregulate our distress.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what do we do when that go-to mechanism like only amplifies any of those three?
Yeah. Right.
I think that's where working with a spiritual director, working with a therapist, pastoral counseling, right? It's a different, like we're not tuning into information from the world in an attempt to regain flow.
Yeah.
We really are doing what God created us to do.
Yeah.
When he said it's not good for man to be alone.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like we get in the room with somebody who's compassionate, someone who's ethical, someone who's got healthy boundaries, someone who's trained. And it's in that space that we regain our flow.
Yeah.
Right? We can process the anger. We can process the grief.
Yeah.
We can downregulate and minimize the anxiety because there's a present moment that is relational and not self-contained.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I think that's part of, even in the church, right? Like we have been shaped by the belief that, and we would say, like Carnes wrote this, right? Like, no one's going to take care of my needs, so I have to take care of myself. Mm-hmm. But that's problematic when our belief systems, in some points in time and in some place in the church, emulate that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, just me and Jesus, like, we're going to take care of this together. Except, like, Jesus pretty frequently is pointing people to relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? Clothing the naked, feeding them, like, those things are all good. Another podcast, we can maybe delve into the whole like perversion of social justice biblically, but not today. But those are all interpersonal experiences. Mm-hmm. From the cross, mother behold your son behold your mother. Like in the penultimate experience of their grief and loss, their hopes are dashed. Christ is on the cross dying, which he literally like left the breadcrumb trail for the disciples.
Yeah.
Like this is going to happen, and I'm going to be raised again in third grade, like the sign of Jonah. In the penultimate experience of their grief and their anxiety and probably their anger, right?
Yeah.
Like, what does Jesus say? Mother, behold your son.
Yeah.
Son, behold your mother. Like, relationship. And that's where I think the sacredness of pastoral care and counseling, the sacredness of space, even though I'm not a pastor, as a believer, right? Like, I hold a sacredness in that space.
Absolutely.
Around something is happening here that can't happen in any other milieu. It can't happen in any other way.
Yeah, absolutely.
How would you like to reboot your personal finances this year? How would you like to take control of your money, turning small wins into big results? I want to encourage you to check out my wife Tina's financial coaching business at tinanorris.org. You might be wondering, what is a financial coach? A coach is someone who will personally team up with you to outline financial goals, inspire you with energy, help you stay focused on your goals, and so much more. You can do it all through Zoom, and she provides a free initial consultation, so there's no pain or cost to you for your first steps. Maybe you've been to several Financial Peace University cycles, left with great intentions, but struggled to execute. You need a trainer, a coach, another human that won't shame or judge you to help you stay on track. She works with clients that are single parents, everyday people, pastors and church staff, as well as high-income professionals. If you have friends, church members, clients, or even young marrieds that are launching their financial lives, you'll do them all a favor to have them check out this amazing option. If professional athletes need a coach to win the day to fulfill their dreams, then you and I do too. And you won't find anybody better to help you get there than Tina Norris. Set up your free consultation from anywhere in the world today. Go to tinanorris.org to find out all the details.
Well, I've been deep diving into a book called Dopamine Nation. And she is a psychiatrist that works with clients, but she is a researcher that deals with the biochemical reactions around a lot of things, but dopamine. She works with addicts. Anne Leminke or something of that sort is her name. And in it, you have this dopamine experience where you have a stable baseline. And anytime you have a high spike of dopamine, an experience of high dopamine, you're going to have an equal dip into the pain side of the pleasure. So the pain-pleasure kind of experience.
Yeah, opponent process theory for those that are interested in
the process theory.
Opponent process, yeah.
Opponent process, yes. And so when she's talking about this, it fascinates me because there is a different experience. Now I'm hypothesizing. I'm going off-roading here, and this research probably has never been done. But intuitively, there is a difference in a dopamine experience that is gaming or somebody who's looking for an extreme experience. There is a difference in that. And then one that is interpersonal. So even in a sexual experience, if a person is medicating or managing or coping with their anxiety through porn and masturbation, they're going to have a high spike of dopamine. But afterwards, they're going to have pain. And Christians think that that's a spiritual experience. It's a biochemical experience. Not saying that there's not a spiritual part of it, but it's a biochemical experience. But it's fascinating that that doesn't happen when you are in a connected, intimate experience with another human.
Right.
And so what I'm hypothesizing is that if oxytocin is present, with another biochemical, the love hormone, if it's present with the dopamine and the other cocktail of biochemicals, that it somehow keeps it from dipping down below that midline. Absolutely. Is that research that you've heard or seen?
That's research I've done, right? Like, so you're spot on. Like, this is part of my kind of post-orgasmic window construct, where the post-orgasmic window, when there's not the presence of, not even another person and oxytocin present, but a stable, secure attachment relationship, which is going to amplify vasopressin and other neuropeptides, neurochemicals, et cetera. Like that, because we can use our spouses sexually, and just because we're attached to them, right? Like
objectify it,
and it gets into
which way are you going with that? Are you talking? Because for a minute there, I was framing that you might be going to that a husband and wife could actually have sexual relations, but it not be something that's intimately connected. It's more of 100%. An objectification. Are you talking that or the other side?
I'll speak to both.
Okay,
right. But what I'm saying right now is you could have a securely attached, healthy, connected marital situation where sex is not actually bonding, And a lot of that has to do with the post-orgasmic window. And I think this gets into other forms of pleasure as well. Hobbies and other things that we do spousally. It's why it's important to be at church together, why it's important to go on date nights, why it's important to have hobbies. But because of the intent, it's easier to make the case for this because of the neurochemistry of human sexuality. A lot of this comes from when you have couples who are dealing with infertility. And they just get into the mechanical, biological dimensions of sex. Like, it's a really emotionally difficult space to traverse.
Yeah.
Right, to self-disclose a little bit. Like, it's really difficult when sex doesn't involve, like, a sense of bonding, a sense of connection. It's really just, like, we have to do this. Mm-hmm. And we have all this pain and all this fear and all this frustration, right, of, like, is it going to work? Are we going to have more kids? Are we not? So I know that personally, and I know that by way of lots of couples that I've walked that journey with. Right, so there's space where even in a healthy, God-honoring Christian relationship, and it's not just in that space of kind of sex being mechanical in spaces of infertility, but even in like how addictive sex can show up in good Christian marriages, where it's more about intensity of pleasure rather than, right, how do we honor God's design, which is... Because what happens is dopamine drops out almost instantly. An interesting book, I'm going to say interesting because it's full of like lots of non-Judeo-Christian beliefs, is Cupid's Poisoned Arrow. Okay. All right, she talks about this. Your Brain on Porn, Peter Wilson, Gary Wilson, yourbrainonporn.com. He's a biologist. She wrote this book, I can't remember her name right now. Cupid's Poisoned Arrow, but talks about dopamine hangover is really what you're talking about, and how there's this 7-day period where there's not healthy resolution to our dopaminergic activation, opponent process theory, right? That's what she's drawn on, like where we do have a crash, and we know the research suggests that we see colors less brightly, we have more sense of fatigue, right? Like our entire body, like who does that study? Like if you have a dopamine hangover, like do you literally see colors less vibrantly? Yes, like there's a neurochemical hangover where you see colors less vibrantly. Your partner is less attractive to you. Right? So how do we offset, like, okay, there's this huge spike of dopamine, but then there's this crash. Well, we're not trapped in the crash, in the hangover, right? That's where, to your point, oxytocin, that's where connection. But for me and the couples that I've worked with, navigating that post-orgasmic window, what does that 15 minutes after the intensity of the spike look like? Yeah. Right? If it's full of caressing and snuggling and just feeling the warmth, right? We call it sex flushing, right? Like your cheeks, your body will give you indicators of like, I would call that true like satiation, and that's the resolution. Right? We just had Thanksgiving. Like if you cooked a turkey and had the little thing in it, like it pops when it's done. Yeah. Right? Like the temperature gauge or like the meat's done. Bing. Our bodies do the same thing. Yeah. Right? Like there's this influx of serotonin and oxytocin and vasopressin, and we're bonding. There's deepening of the bonds. Fat, I won't bore you with all the research. It's really incredible, like what happens in male and female neurophysiology when that space is shared well. Wow. So yes, right. Like, and again, not trying to make this conversation about sex. Like I've got more expertise than just sex addiction. But it's a huge lens. It is, and because of the intensity, it's just easier for us to recognize. Okay, like here's what we're created for, and there's this uniqueness in sexuality that I think is meant to be lived into similarly in non-sexual arenas of our lives and relationships. Absolutely. Which is to what does it look like to share contentment, to share joy, not to depend on the pleasure of that. In fact, I would suggest that life in that post-orgasmic window really births a sense of contentment and joy and lightheartedness, and we're not stuck in anger or grief or anxiety. Yeah. Right? Like because we've bonded well. And again, like to move that outside the bedroom, what does it look like to cook dinner together, to sit down and sit next to each other, feel the warmth of one another's body, watching a show? Yeah. Same thing for kids, right? Like where sexually they're not developed to that point, but can we borrow some of these principles of, you know, like, are we watching the show on couches all scattered across the room, or like, do I let my 6-year-old snuggle up next to me while we're watching whatever? Am I on my phone while he's watching his show and he doesn't really feel my presence? Yeah. Right. It's no different than like, are his eyes closed and he's thinking about porn in his mind while he's making like there has to be a presence. Yeah. And again, I think behaviorally, because we're still under this behavioral or physiological umbrella of the model that we started with, cognitions, emotions, and physical. Like even that, like that disengagement. I'm tuning out of my present awareness, looking at my phone when I've got my kids right here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And it doesn't have to be an hour of like sustained, focused attention with your kids.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. But like interacting with them, meet them in their world, play video games, sit down and watch the show, learn what they're learning. I learned a lot about what second graders are talking about a couple weeks ago. I had no idea what Squid Game was, right? Like Squid Game, you know what it's called, right? It's this Korean show that is like pretty graphic and pretty violent.
Oh, wow.
Like people die and they're competing for like money to get out of debt. And my 7-year-old, second grader, was like, I was like, hey, what you guys play today on the playground? We played red light, green light, like from Squid Games. I was like, from what? Like, what's Squid? So I'm looking up Squid Game. I was like, oh, like how are second graders talking about this on the playground? Right, so like we can attune to them. We have conversations about that, right? Like, no, we're not going to watch that show. Like, it's really inappropriate. It's right, like got people dying, and like if they lose the game, they die. Like that's not what happens in real life. Like, so we're going to stay in real. But just tuning in and getting present for a little bit. Like, you're allowed to be on your phone. You need to check your email. You're allowed to have that privation of space where you look at Instagram, where you look at what you're shopping for Christmas, whatever you're doing on your phone, right? As long as it's like God-honoring, appropriate, like you're allowed to have that space, but not at the expense of this moment of bonding.
Absolutely.
Pastors, did you know that upwards of 70% of the men in your congregation are regularly accessing pornography, stuck in shame, torn in conflict, and therefore immobilized for zealous ministry? That's 7 out of 10. The problem is not going to go away. What are you doing to lead your men into wholeness? Porn and sex addiction is characterized by undesirable compulsive behaviors that feature incongruence with personal values, and it interferes with normal living, causing stress on their relationships with God, family, friends, loved ones, and possibly even their own work environment. Well, where do you send men to recover and become both whole and integrated? Red Ink Recovery offers a unique program exclusive to porn and sex-related addictions. Our clinical professionals, our psychologists and therapists, have created a transformative treatment process that collects the dots, connects the dots, and corrects the dots that have driven the addictions. Our approach heals the heart, restores the soul, and rebuilds the neuroplasticity of the brain. Our clients find their lives have been wildly marked by Christ as they are given a path for trust being rebuilt. And they are resourced for far greater relationships and intimacy than they have ever known before. All of our professional teammates are experts in the field of sexual addiction. They are all trained by Dr. Patrick Carnes and certified by the International Institute of Trauma and Addiction Professionals. Dr. Carnes is known as the father and curator of modern sexual addiction recovery as a movement. Pastors, we encourage you to recommend your men who struggle to come to one of our intensives. If you are just a simple man that struggles, maybe you're new to the faith or you don't even know what you believe about Christ, be encouraged to join us. We will honor your journey and give you the tools to live in wholeness. To find out more about our porn and sex addiction intensives and when the next one is, go to redinkrevival.com.
I think it's so fascinating that for any dopamine experience that you have, and dopamine is the feel good, it's focus, it's execution, it is the pursuit of a goal.
Driver, yep.
So you have this wonderful thing in you, this chemical that is dopamine. But for every time you go into high pleasure, you're going to have an equal amount of pain afterwards, except when it's mitigated or mixed with other neurochemicals like oxytocin and vasopressin. And I think about that with even how we are raising our kids or how we're leading our churches, that we need to also be aware that today a lot of people's discontentment is because they're on their phone, looking at Facebook, looking at Instagram, and they don't even know why. They're like, I got nothing else to do. I've done it. I don't have anything else to do, so I'm doing this. Well, what my brain's doing and what everybody's brain's doing is they're in a dopamine loop. They are looking for the pursuit of more dopamine. And they've gotten dopamine by watching, and it can be as simple as even a heightened awareness of a threat. So, on my feed, I watch and am following people that I diametrically disagree with, politically, even around philosophical issues and theological issues, as well as a bunch of people that I agree with. And when I see stupid, and people, there is no way there's an intellectual integrity on some things that are posted. They know good and well, but actually I see it on both sides, where they aren't saying a thing because it's a good point. They're saying a thing because they know it will create a different perspective that isn't accurate. It's not true. It's not helpful. And I feel a heightened increase. Well, what my brain does is says there is an increase of focus. There's an increase of execution, a driving, and so I get a dopamine hit. Well, if I'm not aware of this constant hit, I'm going to, in my dopamine receptors, I'm going to be needing more and more. And so what my brain's doing when I stay on social media for no reason is I'm looking for more dopamine, whether it's against someone who's I disagree with, or whether it's looking for a puppy that I'm enjoying that I just want to feel something. And so when I think of a pastor, I think of us as leaders, whether it's our team members or whether it is people in our congregations, if they're dealing with depression, or you're noticing people that are in higher rage moments, just to get your lens on, I wonder how they're managing their dopamine increases, because for every high, they're getting a low. And they're not going to know why. They're going to feel like it's an attack. This is so funny for me. They're going to feel like it's a complete attack of the devil. And this spiritual bypass of make everything the devil, or make everything something in the framework of what God in his sovereignty created or designed. Pull back and realize, wait, God designed you as a free moral agent with a lot of neurochemicals, and you're the one who's required to manage that. So if I can help you manage that, which incidentally all of Scripture actually undergirds the mental health of a human, it will. If you'll do the Bible, you'll have good, appropriate mental health and neurochemical balances. And I say that, I don't mean to minimize people who have, some kind of disorder. But at the same time, it's quite incredible to me. I think as we begin to wrap this up, what would you give as solutions overall to, right now you have the commonalities of people that, the cognitive, the affective, and the biological, the physical. You got these three areas. What seems to be a common solution or a common treatment or a common, how do we move forward?
I would say it starts with increasing self-awareness.
It's amazing, isn't it? It always starts.
Tuning into ourselves. What is happening in my body and what does that mean?
Yeah.
What's the direction of my desire? What's the direction of levels of pain, levels of swelling, levels of discomfort in my body? Is my back out all the time? Is my neck out all the time? Yeah. Your body is just trying to help. All those aches and pains are just your body trying to help orient you to the reality. There's a need that's being unaddressed here.
Yeah.
Right? Do I need to go to the chiropractor? Do I need to go? Am I getting an annual physical? Do I have a series of data points to know even where there's change? Most of us tend to do that.
Yeah.
So we allow external points of reflection, right? Your cholesterol's going a little high. Okay, I need to do something about that. We can do that emotionally and behaviorally for ourselves, right? Not change our cholesterol necessarily. We can do that with some behavioral changes, eating changes, exercise. But on an emotional level, we just stagnate. It's amazing how often I see people stuck, and there's almost a learned helplessness. I don't know what to do, so I'll read self-help books, or listen to podcasts, but I'm not going to sit with somebody else. I'm not going to share my story. I'm not going to acknowledge the reality of what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, what I'm going through. That starts with self-awareness, right? Because in self-awareness, I don't know that there's any true humility. There's desperation that compels. I inherit people who find themselves in desperate moments, and know I practice all the time.
Yeah.
They're desperate, and that's what compelled them. If you'd been here 6 months ago.
Yeah, right.
How much of this we could have mitigated.
Yeah. Yep.
By just changing the course of your marriage, changing the course of your behavior. But true humility, I think, is dependent on self-awareness. Like on tuning into what is my reality, what's it going to cost for me to break through denial and tune in like, okay, like I'm struggling right now.
Yeah.
I'm depressed right now. I'm anxious right now. I'm in an addiction spiral right now. Okay, like I recognize that. Now can I humble myself and move toward relationship in the way that God created us?
Yeah.
And Scripture is pretty clear numbers of times, like, pity the one who has no one there to pick him up when he falls, right? Like, two are better than one because when one stumbles, there's one there to pick him up. But it's in Proverbs. Right, bear one another's burdens. Like, you're right. Like, our mental health, this sense of balance in our lives, when we live out these principles of Scripture thoroughly, like it does. Again, like there's biological dimensions of mental illness and disruptions. There's circumstantial dynamics to that, death of people that we love, divorce situation. But by and large, as we really take in the Word and live out of the Word, like it's amazing how there's a sense of balance that we're invited to.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that gets into, right, like, and then we're talking about what does it mean to live in a peace that passes all understanding? Like, it doesn't make sense to the world. Like, how we can, as believers of Christ, empowered by the Holy Spirit, like, how can we transcend some of the trappings of circumstance, the trappings of this historical perspective or period that we're in, this era that we're in? Like, we don't do it in our own power.
Yeah.
But it starts with, like, are we self-aware? Are we willing to humbly enter into relationships where people are willing or good, they desire the best for us, and they're healthily boundaried, ethically driven people.
Right.
It's not just like, there's people that say things in my office that I hope they never say anyplace else. Like, I hope that that's a safe space and that's why they're saying it.
Yeah.
Because their life will be much better if they say the things they need to in my office and they don't say them at home with the kids around. They don't say them in the car with their wife. They don't say it at work.
Yeah.
Right. And it becomes, again, that's part of the sacredness, right? Like, that you can leave things here.
Yeah.
And I can help you regain your flow so that when you leave, like,
you
can live in the fullness of what God's created you for, and you can live in this flow that's going to help you navigate the trappings of what's happening all around us.
Let me break in one more time and tell you about RedInkRevival.com. That is REDINK Revival.com. I want to encourage you to go there and sign up for our blog e-newsletter. Every month it will hit your inbox with a blog post and new special events that will ink your soul with revival.
When you talk about awareness with your clients, how do you train them? How do you, I mean, it's not just part of it sitting in the office and you just pointing out that reality, that there is something happening in you. What is it? There's a narrative, there is an emotion that you can label and identify, and there is meaning that you've attached to it. Even when I look at the different posts that I find inflame experiences, I'm looking at it because I'm like, this is idiotic. You know that this isn't thoughtful. When I see that, I do have to say I'm very aware. In that moment, oh, look what's happening in me.
Right.
There's something happening in me. What do you do to teach or train your clients?
So in 2019, I created an exercise. I call it the bioaffective awareness exercise. Right? And really, it kind of looks like a murder scene, right? Like, it's just an outline of a body with some instructions to first tune into your body and use different. You can use colored pencils. You can use crayons. I'm happy to give it to you so you can put it on the Red Ink Revival webpage. But it's just about, like, let's start with the body. Let's go bottom up.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we're so disconnected from our bodies typically in our culture. Let's start, what's there? Does my knee hurt? Do I've got tightness in my neck or my throat? Do I have burning in my chest? Is my stomach upset? Are my hands cold? Am I what? And just starting people with, like, today, when you notice an emotion, right? Like, label it and then go down in your body.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I think most of us think that emotions start between our ears. They don't. They start in our bodies.
Yeah.
And if anything, right, like, we have to integrate the body into our understanding of emotional experiences and behavioral manifestations of those. So just teaching people, let's slow down, right? Like, let's build some awareness. Yeah. Let's connect it to your body. So let's get vertically integrated.
Yeah.
let's honor the reality of that emotion, and let's start giving some language to it. So getting horizontally integrated between right and left hemisphere, and tell the story. Right. So it's literally just an outline of a body where someone, and over time we start to see patterns. Right? We've got one client who's done this for a long time. Because just normally I have people do it for about a month, and that's a nice snapshot. I've got people who do it much longer than that, and the longer one does this, you can start to see these patterns.
Yeah.
Right. For me, it's helpful because I can start seeing, like, is there trauma that your body's carrying that you just can't access?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've got a client that I'm thinking of where their pattern, like, was very evident. Like, big emotional experience, flat.
Yeah.
Big emotional experience, flat. Right. Like, okay, so clearly, like, there's hypoactivity, which is a traumatic response.
Yeah.
Like, now I need to lean into the trauma. It doesn't matter if people have trauma. Like, it's just beneficial for them to start integrating these parts of themselves.
Yeah.
How their physical experiencing, their emotional reality, and their thought life are all interwoven.
Let me jump in. So when you say you want to reintegrate those, I just want to say for our audience, we're not talking some kind of mythological, just, imaginary reconnect and reintegrate. We're literally saying what you do is you're helping the parts of the brain and the body to build neural pathways that maybe were never strengthened from childhood up. And so this is not just some kind of we're trying something out. This is research proven. What happens in the brain when you're able to do, like this worksheet?
Yeah.
This worksheet is simply taking pavement and putting it over a dirt road and saying, now you can drive easier on this. It makes it easier.
Or if there had been a paved road, it's full of potholes because of what cortisol does to our neurological connections. And we're like, let's just refinish this. It takes some time, right? Like, it's a bit annoying. We've all been on I-35 recently, or 435 here in Kansas City. I'm sure where other people live.
They've got them.
They've got roads that have been under construction. It takes some time. You're going to have to go down to one lane, which means you're going to have to slow down.
Yeah.
Like, while the potholes while the dirt road is being finished.
Yeah.
And it changes.
Yeah.
It changes how people function. And it's a matter of, can we live in that consistently? But it's congruent with Scripture. It's about slowing down. It's about taking thoughts captive. It's about not letting anger get a foothold and not worrying about tomorrow and really relation, right? Like, but then it's not just like, go do the worksheet.
Yeah.
Like, then clients bring it back in and we process.
Yeah.
And we talk about, okay, like, here's what I'm seeing. Here's my expertise. Here's what I know about your story. Here's what's missing from this, right? Like, help me make sense of this other piece that's not there.
Amazing. Yeah.
So all these activities are great. Self-help is great. Podcasts are great. But to really fully metabolize the significance of that, it has to be done with right brain to right brain integration. So we can talk about self-contained integration vertically, horizontally. But, like, from birth, we're doing right brain to right brain integration.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? And that means FaceTime. That means looking in one another's eyes. That means there's tone of voice. That means there's a quiet environment, right? Like, therapy is kind of like getting your kid ready for a nap in many regards when they're babies. Like, there's a reason our offices are all painted gray or beige, and we have a comfortable couch, and there's art on the walls, and it's all purposefully oriented to awaken a specific type of response that just lets us have access to the parts of you that we need to have access to be able to help.
Absolutely.
Right.
I love it. I love it. Well, one of the things that we do at Red Ink, which you are real familiar with, is I do 6-week groups. Mm-hmm. And in it, we dig down into people's stories, and we're able to do that. We actually do it online through Zoom. And in 2022, as our numbers continue to increase, we will be scaling and doing that. In fact, you have opted in and said that you would like to carry some of those groups. So we will... I guess I want to emphasize that people who've gone through it have found radical impact upon their life. And the quality of life change and transformation that begins to happen is something that takes them by surprise. And so we're working with church staffs, whole staffs, and we'll continue in 2022, and I'm just excited about it. Well, thanks again for another great episode. I love getting to talk about all this stuff. And again, maybe we'll hop on another time and get into some of the deeper things that you were even talking about right there.
Yeah, sure thing. It's always an honor to be here. Love doing it and looking forward to next time.